December 16, 1944. 9:12 a.m. Somewhere over the frozen Ardennes, Lieutenant Adrian Foster feels a violent thud that vibrates through his teeth. In the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, the oil pressure gauge isn't just dropping, it's flatlining. An 88mm flak shell has just turned the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine into a collection of shredded aluminum and seizing steel. Foster has approximately 45 seconds before the Jug, 7 tons of American war machine, becomes a glider with the aerodynamic properties of a tombstone. He pulls the canopy, rolls the dying fighter, and drops into a white hell, the sub-zero forests of the German-Belgian border. Below him, the 1st SS Panzer Division is beginning Hitler's last great offensive. The mathematics are brutal. A downed Allied pilot in the Rhineland has a 95% chance of being executed on sight or freezing to death in the snow. Adrian Foster is about to become the 5% exception. In 6 days he won't just evade capture. He'll walk onto a Nazi airfield and hijack a Focke-Wulf 198, the very machine that ruled the skies he was just blown out of. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Adrian Foster was born on a farm in Ohio in 1922. By age 8, he could strip a tractor engine blindfolded. While other boys were learning to hunt, Foster was learning the language of internal combustion. This mechanical obsession would become his primary weapon of war. By 1944, Foster is a lead pilot for the 362nd Fighter Group. His tool is the P-47, the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. 444 miles per hour at 29,000 feet. 17,500 pounds, fully loaded. The Germans called it the Fliegender Sarg, flying coffin, because of its size, yet Foster handled it like a feather. He lived and breathed American engineering. But the machine that would eventually save his life was the Focke-Wulf 198, nicknamed the Butcher Bird. It was the antithesis of the American Jug, compact, agile, and powered by a BMW 801 radial engine. The cockpit was a death trap for an American. Every label was in German Gothic script. The throttle operated on the Kommandogerät, the world's first primitive engine computer that synchronized fuel, spark, and pitch into a single lever. To fly it, Foster wouldn't just need to be a pilot. He would need to hack the mechanical brain of the Third Reich's most advanced interceptor while under direct fire. In the autumn of 1944, the air over occupied Europe didn't belong to the daring or the reckless. It belonged to the machines. And in the 362nd Fighter Group, no machine commanded more respect than the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. To the men of the 9th Air Force, it was simply the Jug. Standing nearly 13 feet tall and weighing over 7 tons when fully loaded with 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and 2 500-pound bombs, it was a flying fortress compressed into a single-seat fighter. It was built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders of raw, air-cooled power that could drag 7 tons of American steel to 30,000 feet and keep it there at 440 miles per hour. Adrian Foster didn't just fly the Jug, he understood its pulse. Born in 1922 on a sprawling farm in Licking County, Ohio, Foster's education hadn't come from textbooks, but from the grease-stained internals of a John Deere Model D. At age 8, while other children were learning to read, Foster had successfully diagnosed a cracked manifold that had stumped his father for a month. By 12, he was the local authority on the timing of internal combustion engines. He possessed a rare, intuitive mechanical empathy, the ability to feel a vibration in a fuselage and know exactly which bolt was shearing 3 feet away. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army Air Forces didn't just see a pilot, they saw a technician who could weaponize a cockpit. By December 1944, Foster was a seasoned flight leader stationed at Étain-Rouvres, France. The mission of the 362nd was interdiction, the surgical destruction of German logistics. Every morning, Foster would climb into the cockpit, strap into the armored seat, and lead his flight toward the Siegfried Line. Their job was to hunt the Schwarzkapelle, the trains, fuel trucks, and Tiger tanks that Hitler was desperately funneling toward the Ardennes forest. The P-47 was the perfect tool for this carnage. Its 8 M2 Browning machine guns could shred a locomotive's boiler in a 3-second burst, and its rugged air-cooled engine could take a 20mm cannon hit and keep turning. The pilots of the 362nd knew that as long as they were in the air, they were the hunters. But the weather was changing. The Great Frost of 1944 was descending, turning the Belgian border into a landscape of jagged ice and low slate-gray clouds. On the morning of December 16th, as Foster taxied his Thunderbolt toward the runway, he noticed something strange. The radio was unusually quiet. The usual chatter of Allied ground controllers was being replaced by a frantic, static heavy urgency. He didn't know yet that 3 German armies were currently smashing through the American lines just 30 miles to the east. As he pushed the throttle forward, feeling the 2,000 horses of the R-2800 scream into life, Foster caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the canopy glass. A farm boy from Ohio about to fly into the largest land battle in American history. He checked his manifold pressure one last time, unaware that in less than an hour, the complex American engineering he trusted with his life would be replaced by a terrifying silence, leaving him with only one impossible question. How do you fly a plane designed by the men who are trying to kill you? The silence was more violent than the explosion. When the 88mm flak shell detonated beneath the fuselage, the roar of the WWII engine vanished, replaced by the whistle of wind over the canopy and the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of cooling metal contracting in the sub-zero air. Adrian Foster didn't have time for fear, only for the cold mathematics of physics. He was at 1,500 feet over the dense, snow-choked canopy of the Ardennes. He rolled the 7-ton P-47 inverted, released his harness and kicked clear. The shock of the opening parachute was a brutal snap that nearly dislocated his shoulders, followed by a terrifyingly brief drift through a slate-gray sky before the world turned into a vertical maze of pine needles and snapping branches. He didn't hit the ground, the forest caught him. Foster came to a swinging halt 30 feet up, tangled in the upper limbs of a massive spruce. The air was minus 10 degrees Celsius, and the moisture from his breath crystallized instantly on his flight suit. With numb fingers, he fumbled for his survival knife and hacked through the risers, plunging through the remaining branches into 3 feet of fresh, powdery snow. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, leaving him gasping in a silence so profound it felt heavy. As he struggled to his feet, checking for broken bones, he checked his wristwatch. It was 10:15 a.m., December 16, 1944. He was deep within the Eifel region, a territory that should have been a quiet sector but now vibrated with a low-frequency dread. Foster pulled his silk map from his flight boot, his hands shaking as he oriented himself. He was roughly 30 miles behind what had been the Allied front line just hours ago. But as he looked west, he didn't hear the comforting thunder of American artillery. Instead, the forest began to groan. It started as a distant, metallic squeal, like a rusted gate swinging in the wind, followed by a heavy rhythmic thumping that shook the snow from the trees. Foster scrambled toward a ridge, keeping low in the waist-deep drifts, and peered through a break in the pines. Below him, on a logging road that wasn't on his map, a column of steel was churning through the mud and ice. They weren't retreating, they were advancing. These were Tiger Eye tanks of the 1st SS Panzer Division, their 56-ton frames painted in jagged winter camouflage. The bulge in the line wasn't just a tactical shift, it was a total collapse. Foster realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't just a downed pilot waiting for a rescue team. He was an ant in the path of Hitler's last great steamroller. He was trapped in the epicenter of the Battle of the Bulge, and the nearest friendly airfield was now 100 miles of enemy-held territory away. He retreated into the shadows of the pines, his mind racing through survival protocols, but his eyes kept drifting toward the north. He knew that the German advance required forward air support, which meant there were Luftwaffe strips hidden in these very woods. As he crouched in the freezing dark, listening to the clatter of tank treads, he realized his only way home wasn't through the forest, it was through the air. But between him and the sky lay a terrifying obstacle. He had no weapon, no heat, and the only planes within reach belonged to the men currently hunting him down for sport. By the third day, the white hell of the Ardennes had stripped away Adrian Foster's identity as a pilot, leaving only a starving animal in a tattered flight suit. The temperature had plummeted to a record-breaking minus 20 degrees Celsius, a brutal reality of the 1944 winter that historians would later call the worst in half a century. Foster's survival training had been theoretical. The reality was a desperate struggle for every calorie. With his emergency rations long gone, he resorted to the grim survival tactics of a man on the brink, using his survival knife to peel the inner cambium layer from frozen birch trees. It was bitter, woody, and offered little more than a psychological distraction from the gnawing vacuum in his stomach. He stayed off the main logging trails, moving only through the dense thickets where the snow reached his waist, knowing that the roads now belonged to the Wehrmacht. On the fourth night, The wind became a physical blade, forcing him toward the outskirts of a small hamlet near the Belgian border. He found a partially collapsed stone farmhouse and slipped into the cellar, huddling beneath a pile of rotting burlap sacks. He had been there for 2 hours when the sound of heavy jackboots crunched on the frozen gravel above. A unit of Waffen-SS soldiers, identifiable by the distinctive runic insignia on their winter parkas, entered the house to escape the gale. Through the cracks in the floorboards, Foster watched the flickering light of their flashlights and smelled the agonizing scent of their heated canned rations. He held his breath until his lungs burned, his hand white-knuckled around the grip of his M1911A 1.45 caliber pistol, knowing that a single cough would end his story in a cellar grave. By day 6, the physical toll was no longer negotiable. The dry cold had turned his toes into numb, waxen blocks, the early, unmistakable signs of stage 2 frostbite. His weight had dropped by an estimated 15 pounds and his cognitive functions were fraying. He began to hallucinate the hum of a tractor engine back in Ohio. He reached a clearing overlooking a shallow valley and collapsed against a jagged outcrop of rock. He looked down at his blackened fingertips and then at the road below, where a German horse-drawn supply column was slowly meandering west. Surrender was the logical choice. The Geneva Convention offered a slim hope of a POW camp, a warm stove and a bowl of watery soup. He began to push himself up, ready to wave his silk map as a flag of truce, when a sound stopped him cold. It wasn't the clatter of horse hooves or the rumble of a Tiger tank. It was a high-pitched, mechanical whine, the unmistakable scream of an inertia starter being cranked by hand. He looked past the supply column toward a hidden grove of trees and saw a flash of black-green RLM-70 camouflage. A miracle was sitting in the clearing, but it was guarded by the very men who had spent the last week trying to kill him. Foster didn't just see a plane. He saw a machine that required a specialized cold start procedure he had only ever read about in captured intelligence reports. If he moved now, he wouldn't just be surrendering his freedom, he would be gambling his life on a single mechanical lever that functioned the exact opposite of everything he had ever been taught. The high-pitched whine led Adrian Foster through a screen of frozen larch trees to the edge of a hidden auxiliary strip, a Feldflugplatz hacked out of the forest. This was no permanent base. It was a forward refueling point for the Luftwaffe's 2. Grupp/Jagerschwader 1. Below him, a group of Schwarz Manner, the black-clad German ground crews, scurried around a single aircraft like ants around a beetle. They were dressed in oil-stained black coveralls, their faces smudged with soot and grease as they wrestled with a heavy fuel hose connected to a horse-drawn tanker. The efficiency was chilling. Despite the sub-zero temperatures and the chaos of the advancing Battle of the Bulge, these technicians worked with a mechanical discipline that Foster, the farm boy from Ohio, couldn't help but admire. Sitting at the center of this frantic activity was a Focke-Wulf FW-198. Even under a canopy of camouflage netting, the butcher bird looked lethal. To a pilot accustomed to the 7-ton bulk of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the FW-190 appeared impossibly compact and predatory. While Foster's jug was a sledgehammer built of American steel, this was a surgeon's scalpel. He watched as a mechanic opened the side cowling, revealing the tightly packed BMW 801D2 radial engine. It was an 1,700 horsepower masterpiece of German engineering, featuring a primitive but brilliant cooling fan that spun at 3 times the engine speed to prevent overheating during low-level flight. Foster began to run the numbers. The A8 was lighter than his P-47, meaning it had a superior roll rate and could likely outturn him at lower altitudes. Its armament was equally terrifying: 4 20mm MG-151 cannons and 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns. If he could get this bird in the air, he would be piloting one of the fastest piston-driven interceptors in the world. But as he watched a pilot in a sheepskin-lined Fliegerjack climb out of the cockpit, Foster noticed something that made his blood run colder than the Ardennes wind. The German pilot didn't struggle with multiple levers for fuel mixture, prop pitch, and throttle like Foster did in the P-47. Instead, he moved a single, thick handle. Foster realized he was looking at the Kommandagerät, the mechanical brain that automated the engine's complex variables. To a pilot who didn't speak the machine's language, that single lever was a riddle. If he jumped into that seat, he wouldn't have minutes to figure it out, he would have seconds. He looked at his blackened, frostbitten fingers and then at the German technician's heavy parka draped over a nearby fuel drum. He didn't just need the plane. He needed the identity of the man who belonged in it. But as he prepared to move, he saw a staff car, a Mercedes-Benz G4, pull up to the edge of the strip, carrying an officer whose rank suggested this wasn't just a routine refueling stop, but the arrival of someone who knew every bolt on that aircraft by name. Adrian Foster moved with the desperation of a ghost. The sub-zero wind howling through the Ardennes pines provided the perfect acoustic cover as he crept toward the perimeter of the Feldflugplatz. His target wasn't the plane, not yet. It was the identity draped over a wooden crate near the fuel depot, a heavy, sheepskin-lined Luftwaffe technician's parka, stained with the holy trinity of wartime aviation: grease, hydraulic fluid, and high-octane B4 fuel. As a group of Schwartz Manor turned their attention to a clogged fuel pump, Foster lunged. He slipped into the oversized coat, pulled the hood low to hide his American features, and walked toward the Focke-Wulf FW-198 with the feigned confidence of a man who belonged there. The transition from the forest floor to the wing root of the butcher bird felt like entering another dimension. As he hoisted himself into the cockpit, the familiar ergonomics of his P-47 Thunderbolt were nowhere to be found. The American Jug was spacious, almost industrial. This German cockpit was a claustrophobic masterpiece of tight tolerances and Gothic labels. His eyes darted across the Revi 16B gun sight to the instrument panel, where every gauge spoke a foreign tongue. Farwerk for landing gear, Drazel for tachometer, and Vorratsansicht for fuel quantity. To a pilot trained on the standardized layouts of the U.S. Army Air Forces, this was an alien machine, a mechanical riddle wrapped in black-green RLM-70 paint. At the heart of the riddle sat the Kommandagerät. Foster stared at the single chunky throttle lever on the left console. In his P-47, he had to manually manage a complex choreography of throttle, propeller pitch, and fuel mixture levers to keep the engine from exploding or stalling. The German engineers at BMW had designed something decades ahead of its time: a mechanical computer. The Kommandagerät used a series of cams and hydraulic valves to automatically synchronize all engine variables into that one single lever. It was brilliant, but for Foster it was a trap. He knew that if he pushed that lever too fast during a cold start, the 1,700 horsepower BMW 801 would flood, backfire, and send a 3-foot plume of blue flame out of the exhaust stacks, a flare that would tell every SS guard on the field exactly where he was. His frostbitten fingers hovered over the ignition switch. He had studied the captured manuals at Attain, but those were translated diagrams on paper. This was vibrating, frozen steel. He located the starter switch, a toggle protected by a wire cage, and his heart hammered against his ribs. He had one chance to engage the inertia starter, a process that would create a rising mechanical scream audible for half a mile. As he prepared to flip the switch, his eyes caught a reflection in the cockpit glass. The Luftwaffe pilot he had seen earlier was walking back toward the aircraft, flanked by 2 guards carrying MP-40 submachine guns, and he was already reaching for the holster at his hip. Foster realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he didn't just need to start the engine. He needed to solve the most complex ignition sequence of the war while the man who actually owned the plane was less than 20 yards away. The German pilot was 10 yards away when Adrian Foster reached for the starter toggle. Behind him, the 2 guards had already unslung their MP-40 submachine guns, the stamped steel stocks clicking into place. Foster ignored the frostbitten agony in his hands and flipped the protective cage on the starter switch. He didn't have the luxury of an external hand crank team. He had to rely on the electric motor to wind the inertia starter's flywheel. As he engaged the switch, a low, mechanical moan began to resonate through the airframe. It rose in pitch, a ghostly, metallic wail that climbed through the frequencies until it became a piercing, high-velocity scream. This was the signature of the butcher bird, the sound of a heavy flywheel spinning up to thousands of revolutions per minute, storing the kinetic energy needed to kickstart 14 massive cylinders. The Luftwaffe pilot froze. He knew that sound, but he also knew the timing was wrong. He began to run, screaming orders in a frantic guttural bark as he reached for his Luger P-08. Foster didn't look back. He watched the tachometer needle quiver. When the whine reached its peak, he pulled the engage handle. There was a violent, gut-punching shudder as the flywheel's energy was dumped into the crankshaft. The 3-bladed VDM propeller jerked, rotated once, twice, and then the BMW 801 engine coughed. A massive cloud of oily blue-gray smoke erupted from the side exhausts, momentarily blinding the approaching guards. Then, with a percussive roar that felt like a physical blow to Foster's chest, all 1,700 horses woke up. The vibration was total. Unlike the smooth, industrial hum of his P-47, the FW-190 felt like a vibrating chainsaw. Foster slammed the canopy shut and locked it just as the first 9mm rounds from the MP-40s spanged, off the reinforced glass of the windshield. Outside, the scene had dissolved into pure chaos. The Schwartz Manor ground crew, who had been calmly disconnecting the fuel line seconds ago, were now diving for cover in the frozen mud. One mechanic stood his ground, pointing a grease-stained finger at the cockpit and screaming at the top of his lungs, "Das ist nicht einer von uns." Sabotage. Sabotage. He had seen Foster's American flight suit through the gaps in the stolen German parka. Foster gripped the throttle of the Kommandantjet, his eyes locked on the narrow, muddy strip of cleared forest ahead. The engine was screaming, the cylinder head temperatures were still dangerously low, and the aircraft was straining against the wheel chocks. He knew that if he stayed static for another 10 seconds, a grenade or a well-placed burst would find his fuel tanks. But as he prepared to fire the engine to full power, he realized a catastrophic flaw in his plan. The FW-190 used a narrow-track landing gear, notoriously unstable on soft, icy ground, and he was currently pointed directly at the Mercedes-Benz G4 staff car parked at the end of the runway. To get into the air, he would have to perform a high-speed ground loop maneuver on a sheet of ice, a feat that had killed even the most experienced Luftwaffe aces. The BMW 801 engine howled, a savage, metallic braying that drowned out the frantic pop-pop of German small arms. Adrian Foster slammed the throttle forward, trusting the Kommandantjet to manage the fuel flow as the FW-190 surged against its wheel chocks. With a violent jerk, the fighter jumped the blocks and began a terrifying dance across the frozen mud. The aircraft's narrow-track landing gear, a notorious design flaw of the Focke-Wulf, fought him at every yard, threatening to collapse or ground loop into the jagged treeline. Foster kicked the rudder pedals with his frostbitten boots, the airframe vibrating so fiercely that the Gothic labels on the panel blurred into a gray smear. Just as the Mercedes-Benz staff car loomed in his peripheral vision, he hauled back on the stick. The tail lifted, the wings caught the sub-zero air, and the butcher bird clawed its way into the slate-gray sky, clearing the forest edge by a mere 10 feet. The moment the wheels left the mud, the world changed. In his P-47 Thunderbolt, every maneuver felt like wrestling a freight train, heavy, deliberate, and requiring massive physical input. The FW-190 was a revelation of light, electric agility. A mere inch of movement on the stick sent the aircraft into a crisp, immediate roll. It didn't feel like a machine, it felt like an extension of his own nervous system. Foster retracted the gear, feeling the mechanical clunk of the electric motors as the black-green wings smoothed out. But there was no time for awe. He was a lone German plane flying over the heart of the Battle of the Bulge, and every man on the ground was currently looking for a target to shoot at. Foster shoved the nose down until he was screaming across the treetops of the Ardennes. He maintained an altitude of 20 feet, the propeller wash kicking up plumes of fresh snow that trailed behind him like a white ghost. This was hedge-hopping, the most dangerous form of flight. By staying below the treeline, he was invisible to the Freya radar arrays of the Luftwaffe, but he was also a target for every Amos infantryman with a Browning M2 and every German with a Flak-Vierling 38. He kept his eyes locked on the horizon, dodging the jagged peaks of the Eifel Mountains, his knuckles white against the grip. He was flying at 350 miles per hour, low enough to see the terrified faces of German infantry as he roared over their heads, their hands reaching for rifles that were too slow to follow his wake. He was roughly 40 miles from the Allied lines, but the front was no longer a neat line on a map. It was a chaotic, shifting mess of fire and steel. As he crossed the frozen Ahr River, the cockpit suddenly erupted with the smell of scorched electrical wire. The FW-190's master caution light began to flicker, a rhythmic red pulse that indicated a catastrophic failure in the fuel transfer pump. If the pump died, the engine would starve in 90 seconds, leaving him to glide into the very American positions he was trying to reach. But as he reached for the emergency override, he saw something even more terrifying. A pair of dark silhouettes emerged from the cloud bank above. They weren't German. They were P-51 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group, and they had just spotted a lone butcher bird trying to sneak across the lines. The sky over the Belgian border was no longer a sanctuary, it was a kill zone. As Adrian Foster crossed the invisible seam of the front lines, the world below erupted in a pyrotechnic display of lethal intent. The American doughboys of the 101st Airborne, dug into the frozen foxholes of Bastogne and the surrounding ridges, didn't see a hero returning home. They saw the jagged, predatory silhouette of a Focke-Wulf 190. Suddenly, the air around the cockpit was stitched with the brilliant, incandescent arcs of M2 Browning .50 caliber tracers. The heavy rounds, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, tore through the winter mist, several thwacking through the thin duralumin skin of Foster's tail section. He was being hunted by the very men he had spent the last year protecting. Foster's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the radio in the FW-190 was useless. He was tuned to Luftwaffe frequencies while the Americans were on VHF. He had no voice, only the language of the machine. Desperate to signal his friendly intent, he performed the pilot's wobble, violently rocking his wings from side to side in a desperate, rhythmic plea for recognition. When the ground fire didn't slacken, he took the ultimate risk. He dropped his landing gear and extended the flaps. In the high-stakes theater of aerial combat, lowering your gear is the universal sign of surrender and mechanical distress. He began fishtailing, swinging the nose of the FW-190 back and forth, showing the American gunners that his 420mm MG-151 cannons were pointed everywhere but at them. The gamble worked, but only for a moment. The drag from the gear and flaps caused the failing fuel pump to finally seize. The BMW 801 gave a final, guttering cough and died, leaving the butcher bird as silent as a falling stone. With his airspeed bleeding off rapidly, Foster spotted a scarred, snow-dusted clearing, a forward resupply and refueling point (RRP) near St. Vith. There was no time to align with the runway. He leveled the wings, braced his boots against the rudder pedals, and cut the master switch. The FW-190 slammed into the Belgian mud at 110 miles per hour. The belly of the aircraft acted like a massive sled, sending up a mountainous rooster tail of frozen earth and snow as it shrieked across the field, eventually coming to a bone-jarring halt just yards from an American fuel truck. Silence returned to the Ardennes, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the smell of scorched hydraulic fluid. Foster sat in the cockpit, his hands still locked on the stick, his chest heaving. He had survived the flight, but the danger was far from over. As he shoved the canopy back and prepared to stand up, he saw a squad of U.S. infantrymen from the 9th Armored Division cresting the nearby ridge. They weren't coming with blankets. They were coming with fixed bayonets and M1 Garens leveled at his head. Foster realized with a surge of panic that he was still wearing the stolen Luftwaffe parka, and in the chaos of the bulge, American soldiers weren't taking prisoners who wore the enemy's skin. The silence of the Belgian countryside was shattered by the metallic clack-clack of 8 M1 Garand bolts locking into place. Adrian Foster stood on the wing of the scorched Focke-Wulf, his hands raised high, the stolen German parka draped over his shoulders like a shroud of treason. A sergeant from the 9th Armored Division, his face weathered by the brutal white Christmas of 1944, stepped forward with his rifle leveled at Foster's chest. In the chaos of the Ardennes, where German commandos were known to be operating in American uniforms, a man in a Luftwaffe coat stepping out of a Nazi fighter was a dead man walking. "Don't shoot!" Foster screamed, his voice cracking from 6 days of thirst and the sub-zero wind. "I'm Lieutenant Adrian Foster, 362nd Fighter Group. I'm from Ohio, damn it. I'm from Licking County." The tension held for a heartbeat, a lifetime in a war zone, until the sergeant noticed the tattered remains of Foster's Usoff flight suit beneath the German wool. The standoff ended not with a handshake, but with a cautious, grueling debriefing. Within 48 hours, Foster was whisked away to a high-level intelligence center in Versailles. There, Allied engineers and test pilots interrogated him not just on his survival, but on the machine he had brought back. Foster's mechanical empathy allowed him to provide the first comprehensive pilot's report on the FW-190A8's handling under extreme stress. He described the eerie simplicity of the commandagerat, the lethal roll rate, and the treacherous narrow-track gear that nearly killed him on takeoff. His audacious heist provided the 9th Air Force with a technical roadmap for defeating the Luftwaffe's most dangerous interceptor. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Foster didn't return to the farm in Ohio. His mastery of the era's most complex war machines, the heavy P-47 and the agile FW-190, made him the ideal candidate for the next frontier of flight. By 1946, he was at Muroc Army Airfield, California, strapped into the cockpit of the Lockheed XP-80 Shooting Star. As the first operational American jet, the XP-80 represented the end of the piston-driven era Foster had helped define. He was no longer a farm boy fixing tractors. He was a pioneer of the jet age, bridging the gap between the internal combustion engines of his youth and the screaming turbines of the future. Looking back on those 6 days in the White Hell, Foster would often tell his fellow test pilots that the Focke-Wulf hadn't just saved his life, it had taught him how to think like a machine. He had realized that a cockpit is just a collection of levers and gauges until a pilot gives it a soul. His legacy wasn't just the 150-mile flight or the frostbitten toes he lost to the Ardennes snow. It was the realization that in the cockpit, there is no us or them, only the physics of flight and the will to survive. As he often remarked when asked about his most dangerous mission, sometimes the best way to beat the enemy is to become them for an hour. But Foster's story hides a darker postscript. Years later, in the classified archives of the Smithsonian, a single German logbook was discovered from that auxiliary field in the Ardennes. It revealed that the Focke-Wulf Foster stole wasn't just a random fighter. It belonged to one of Germany's top-scoring aces, a man who had been watching from the treeline with a sniper rifle as Foster took off. The question remains, why didn't he pull the trigger? To find out what happened to the man who let Adrian Foster live, you'll have to look into the forgotten records of the Schwarzkapelle. Adrian Foster spent 6 days eating frozen bark and losing his toes to frostbite just to bring that Focke-Wulf back. You did the hard part. All I'm asking you to do is the easy part. If you leave this video without hitting like or subscribing, you're letting the algorithm bury his sacrifice under a mountain of mindless vlogs. Don't let a story this important fade into silence. Hit the like button to honor the man from Ohio, and comment, "Survivor," below so I know you made it to the end with him. He didn't give up in the Ardennes. Don't give up on history now.